I love doing research. I'm good at it. There are pigs that search for truffles and pull them up from under the ground. When I go into an archive, that's what I'm good at doing. One of the most exciting things when writing my book about the authorship question was going into an archive at the University of London at the Senate House Library and opening up a manuscript that was claimed to say that Shakespeare's doubts about Shakespeare's authorship were already there in 1785. And I opened up this manuscript in a very quiet, scholarly atmosphere where there were people hunched over, turning old pages, and I started laughing aloud, and everybody looked at me. I was laughing because I knew that it was a forgery, and I knew that it was a forgery because 30 years of accumulating information had taught me what to look for and how to see things, and I'm like a pig with truffles. And it turned out the writer of this manuscript had said Shakespeare hoarded grain, which he did. Shakespeare, when he was in his 30s, speculated in grain, as did most of the leading citizens in Stratford-upon-Avon. But I knew that no one had discovered this until 50 years after this manuscript was written, or purported to have been written. So I exposed it as a forgery. It was thrilling to me, but academics lead boring lives, and especially if you lead those lives in the archives. So I'm very much aware of the importance of looking at primary materials to create a story. And my books take 5 or 10 or 15 years to write because of that. And I also know that when I'm done researching, that I'm going to bore people if I make all that evidence available to them. So then a second stage of creativity is involved, which is turning materials that probably pile this high into something about this high that my son, who's a teenager, can read, that my mother-in-law, who never went to university, will read as a detective story or something like that. And I show the book to many friends who never went to school or never did well in school. Whatever they don't like or don't understand, I get rid of. And what's left is a much tighter, what I hope is exciting book. You know, the question of Shakespeare forgers is a very delicate one. Well, at this very moment, this morning, before you came in and speak with me, I was trying to hunt down a poem that had been quoted in a published article by a preeminent Shakespearean. I won't name names. And I'm about to bring out a volume on Shakespeare in America for the Library of America. And they insist on looking at the original of every poem that is published. And I'm beginning to sense, now that I've done massive research with friends in Stratford and at the Folger Shakespeare Library, that this might possibly be a forgery. And it's terrifying to me, but great Shakespeareans have forged documents. So you have to be incredibly scrupulous. The first great Shakespeare forger was a man named William Ireland, who wanted to impress his father, who loved Shakespeare. And one of the ways in which he tried to do that was to forge documents. And it got carried away, it snowballed. So that his father's friends were so excited, they kept wanting more and more and more. And he kept providing more and more, and he was winning his father, or he might have been a bastard, but that's a separate question. He tried to ingratiate himself until it was all exposed by a man named Malone as a forgery. So there's a long, long history of forgery. There's also a long history of doubting that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. The first person to write a book doubting that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare was a remarkable woman named Delia Bacon. In the 1850s, just when, say, Shakespeare was first brought to Brazil, Shakespeare was not taught in universities in the United States or in England. People read Shakespeare, but it wasn't part of a curriculum. Delia Bacon taught Shakespeare. She taught Shakespeare to young women, and she lectured on Shakespeare publicly in New York and in Connecticut. And she was one of the most brilliant Shakespeareans of the day. She had, as I write about in this book, a traumatic thing happened to her. She fell in love with a man who was a little bit younger, a man named McWhorter. He led her on. She thought they were going to get married, and he jilted her and humiliated her. There was a trial to see what his intentions were. And she barely lost that trial, was humiliated, felt she had to flee the country. She went to England, and she was going to win back her name and reputation by proving that somebody else had written Shakespeare's work. You can't make this kind of story up. And the great American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a beautiful story, a Gothic story, a mad woman in the attic story, about Delia Bacon with an axe, a shovel, and a little light going to Shakespeare's grave in Stratford, convinced that if she pried back the tombstone, she would find the manuscripts that proved that Bacon and others had written the plays. So she was possessed by this, but she's been maligned as a madwoman. She died of madness, but that was after she published her book. And the story of Shakespeare and the people who've gotten obsessed with him is an endlessly fascinating one. I tried as best I could in my book to give Delia Bacon the due she has not been given as a brilliant, brilliant scholar. And as she stopped short of making the claim that Shakespeare didn't write the plays, her work would be celebrated today. One of my heroes, one of my intellectual heroes at university. I studied Freud a lot on these shelves, books of Freud. It's profoundly influenced me. So one of the saddest things about writing Contested Wheel was discovering that Freud didn't believe that, or came to believe that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. We celebrate Freud in part for his Oedipal theory. That is, when his women patients came to Freud and said, "My father is sleeping with me, my uncle is trying to seduce me," Freud had to decide whether these reports were true or fantasies. And he decided they're fantasies. And he came up with an Oedipal theory whereby people make up things and project things based on their feelings and fantasies. And he believed that young men struggled with the desire to kill their fathers and sleep with their mothers. And he came to this theory through reading Hamlet. It's called the Oedipal theory, and it seems to be based on Sophocles' plays, but in fact it's based on Shakespeare's play, which Freud read, and he figured out that he had solved the critical question of Hamlet. Because he knew from reading a biography of Hamlet, published by a man named George Brandes, a Scandinavian author, that Shakespeare's father died right before he wrote Hamlet. Well, 15 years later, Brandes came out with another book in which he said, "I got the date wrong. Shakespeare's father died after he wrote Hamlet." So Freud was stuck. He had two choices. Either he was going to say his Oedipal theory was based on a very shaky and incorrect notion of Hamlet, or somebody else whose father died before he wrote Hamlet must have written Hamlet. It was an easy call. Freud decided that the Earl of Oxford wrote Hamlet and the rest of Shakespeare's works. So my book is in part about the ways, as I suggested earlier, that smart people think dumb things, or people who are so invested in their theories have to trust the theories rather than the facts. There are many, many talented writers and increasingly actors, Derek Jacobi and others, who don't believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Another writer for me that's very painful to learn this about is Mark Twain. Mark Twain is one of the great American writers. And he was exposed to Delia Bacon's theories while he was working on a riverboat on the Mississippi River in the late 1850s. He loved Shakespeare. He was writing about Shakespeare and parodies of Shakespeare throughout his career in his great work Huck Finn earlier on, and his last book was Is Shakespeare Dead?, in which he came out and argued that Shakespeare absolutely did not write Shakespeare. And the reason for this was Twain truly believed that you had to live it to write it. And for Twain there was so much legal knowledge in Shakespeare's work that he could not believe a man who was not a lawyer could have written these works. Now, people who are sailors believe there's so much sailing knowledge in Shakespeare that he had to be a sailor. People who are soldiers believe he had to be a soldier. People who are lovers think he had to be a lover, whether gay, bi, it doesn't make a difference. Every person who comes to Shakespeare believes he speaks to them. But Mark Twain exemplifies this notion that you had to live it to write it. And when you go into creative writing programs in American schools today, that's what they tell you. Write from your own experience. Shakespeare did not write from his own experience. He did not make up his plots. He read Italian novellas. He read Holinshed's chronicles of the English, Scottish, and Irish past. He read North's translation of Plutarch's lives of the Greeks and Romans. That's where Shakespeare got his stories. Twain couldn't accept that because Twain only wrote about what he knew. And he couldn't imagine a great writer writing about something else other than what he knew.
And what about Henry James?
Henry James was very careful. Henry James was a very shrewd man. Henry James made sure he never in public called Shakespeare's authorship into question. But when you look at his correspondence and foisting upon friends anti-Stratfordian books and the introduction he wrote to The Tempest around 1910, you know he couldn't believe it because he considered himself a great writer, and he didn't think any great writer at the height of his fame, having written The Tempest, could resign from the stage because he wasn't ready to stop writing. Shakespeare couldn't stop writing either. I'll tell you something. Shakespeare started writing in the late 1580s, stopped around 1613, 14. He spent his mornings for most of his career until the Jacobean period rehearsing plays, his afternoons staging them, and his evenings reading and writing. After 30 years of this, he was ready to retire, and Henry James couldn't quite imagine and didn't really understand or know as much as we do today about the rigors of Shakespeare's creative life.
Maybe also because Henry James wasn't successful on stage, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Henry James was a failed dramatist. And look, the whole story, when you write Shakespeare biography, and I've written a year in Shakespeare's life, and I'm working on another one, and the first one took 15 years of my life, and this one's taking 10. And it'll be out in 2016, the most exciting year in Shakespeare studies that we'll have seen for probably in 100 years, but probably ever, and around the globe, not just in America, not just in England. One of the things you discover when you write biographies is that you tend to over-identify with your subject. And whether you're Stephen Greenblatt or Jim Shapiro, you have to recognize that tendency to inject yourself and to project yourself onto the subject you're writing and to imagine that person writing the way you would write. Shakespeare lived 400 years ago. It was a very different world, and writing was a very different profession back then. So I try to be as scrupulous as I can about not trying to recognize myself and describe Shakespeare as a version of who I am or might have been 400 years ago. And that requires a lot of discipline. Roland Emmerich is one of the most successful directors. I think his last 10 films earned $1 billion. I'm a small scholar working in a small office in New York City. So it's really a kind of David and Goliath relationship. When you make a movie that's going to cost $35 million and probably as much of that in advertising, you have the potential to change the way people see the world and see who Shakespeare was, especially because the magic of the camera is extraordinary. And it's easier to be persuaded by a film than to sit down and read a book like Contested Will, who wrote Shakespeare, which is what I had spent 5 or 6 years writing without knowing this film was coming. And I lived in dread of this film when I heard it was coming out. And the New Yorker magazine invited Roland Emmerich, and they invited me as well to talk about the film when it had its New York debut. And it was illuminating for me. So to answer the question about what his intentions were, it was not parodic, it was not subtle. Roland Emmerich, as we say in America, had drunk the Kool-Aid, by which I mean he swallowed whole this theory that somebody else wrote Shakespeare. And I had fun that day when we talked. I think I had more fun than he did that day. And I don't really ever take pleasure in somebody's artistic failures, but that film lost a lot of money. And you can trace on websites where films succeed and where films don't. That film did really well in Russia and in Italy, where people believe in conspiracy theories, which is what it's about. It did not do well in America. I don't think it did well in Brazil. It did very poorly in Britain. And that moment where it looked like more and more people would believe that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare has passed. And there's just coming out another volume in England from Cambridge University Press, edited by Paul Edmondson and Stanley Wells, in which I write the afterwards, which is the final nail in the coffin of the anti-Stratfordian movement. Now, that movement's a lot like Dracula. It keeps coming back. It's hard to kill. But I think that that moment has passed. And had Roland Emmerich been more persuasive in that film, it would have made my life a lot more difficult. Because when I come in to teach students or lecture around the world, if I'm speaking about A Year in the Life of Shakespeare or Contested Will, it doesn't matter what I've written. People always say to me, how do you know Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare? So that's why I spent 5 years. We don't have a lot of years in a writing career. So to take 5 or 6 years and say, I'm devoting this to this question of who wrote Shakespeare, so that every teacher, anywhere, in any language, in Russian, in Portuguese, in Korean, can hand this book to a student and say, go read this book, and if you have any questions after, I'm happy to answer them. Because it's hard to make an argument against something as powerful as a film.